Welcome to our classroom. In this space, we talk about education, which is inclusive of, but not limited to, what happens in schools. Education is taking place whenever and wherever we are willing to learn. I am your host, Roberto Germán, and our classroom is officially in session. Today, I'm joined by the authors of Change the Narrative, Henry J. Turner and Kathy Lopes. Henry is principal at Newton North High School in Newton, Massachusetts. He is most proud of the collaborative community he works within to empower students to fight hate and bigotry in their school. Kathy Lopes is a clinical social worker and an educator with over 20 years of experience ranging from primary to post-secondary education. She currently serves as Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Newton Public Schools in Newton, Massachusetts. Thank you for being here. It is my pleasure to have you. Henry, can you share a little bit about yourself before I get into my questions? And then Kathy, I'll ask you to do the same.
Sure. Thank you so much for having us. This is exciting, and we are excited to talk about this book. So I am a high school principal in Massachusetts. I've been a principal for 10 years now, and I came into education over 20 years ago, committed to social justice and addressing racial disparities in our schools. I've worked in large suburban schools that need work to do around its diversity, equity, and inclusion, and making sure that all kids feel loved and seen. So that's just been my mission, and I'm really proud of the work I've done as a principal.
Thank you. Thank you for your leadership. Kathy?
Yes. So I am the Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion for Newton Public Schools. I'm wrapping up my second year in this role, and I got here by way of social work. So I am a social worker by training, and I've done work in education my entire career. I've also dabbled with policy and nonprofit organizations, but I'm always coming back to education, and similar to Henry, just finding opportunities to create spaces for Black and Brown students to feel like they belong, that they can achieve, that they can imagine. So it's really exciting that we were able to come together and put something together that I think is really near and dear to both of us. So
that's awesome. So I have these wonderful perspectives that you bring to the table from the admin lens. And I think it's important that folks hear from administrators. Speaking as a former administrator, oftentimes the stuff I would see posted on social media would feel like a lot of bashing towards administrators. So from my perspective, having been on both sides, and I always got utmost respect from the teachers. And I've always found it important to bring people in to what it is we see from the 30,000-foot level. And you recently published the book, Change the Narrative. I'm curious. Tell us about your book. What narrative are you changing? Why, how, and how much of your experience as administrators played into the way you wrote the book?
So I'll just say that I agree with you. I think that there can be a lot of bashing of administration, and at the same time, is that the research shows is that the number one impact on a student in a school is the teacher. The number two is the leadership. So I think there's a lot of books out there, and that's sort of the driver of this book, is that there's a lot of books out there about how you can do this work yourself in terms of addressing racism, systemic racism, racial inequity in your school. How you can be a better advocate for students. But there isn't anything out there about how do you create a system that dismantles the system to build a system that is for all kids. And that's the narrative that we wanted to shift. And to me, when we started talking about the title, it started with a teacher who was really struggling to say, I can't. It was a history teacher talking about diversifying their curriculum, and he said, well, including all these different narratives doesn't create a narrative for students to understand. And he said, I was thinking about that for several years, and what I realized is that we've got to change the narrative. We've got to recognize that we want students to recognize that history is complex, that it's complicated, that it has many voices, and that is the narrative, not that there's a single narrative, that there are multiple narratives. And I think that is true for how our students exist in school, is that we can't just expect them to all follow the same path. We need students to know that they can follow their own path, their own story, and that everything that they bring into our buildings has a lot of meaning and they have a lot of strengths that will allow them to excel. And I would say that my lens as a change agent, I believe in distributed leadership and working with diverse groups to change culture. That's what drives me as a leader. And Cathy, from her social justice, social work lens, is people centered. And I think that that's really where our combination just made this perfect. Is that many of our conversations were driven around I would talk about some policy and she was focused on the people. How do you bring people along? And I think that's where it just really goes hand in hand.
I love that. It sounds like a beautiful balance. Cathy, can you add to that?
Yeah, I think so much of how I show up in this work and also in this book comes from my own personal narrative of being one of the only students of color in my education from, kindergarten through graduate school. And so I've always really considered, how do you center the voices of those who feel unseen, who feel like they're marginalized? And the narrative has been in education, like comply, assimilate, work harder, stop being lazy. And so for me, it's really thinking about, no, that's not the narrative to put it on these children to assimilate in order to succeed. We have to dismantle. We have to recognize the ways that we're perpetuating harm, we're perpetuating exclusion, and that narrative leaves so many kids out. So I really wanted to shake up how we are seeing this story for student success and student belonging and student agency by shifting that and saying, how do you ask, how do you invite, how do you, bring them in, and how do you center them? Because so often these students are never centered outside of just kind of being told, do more, work harder, and just feeling inadequate in a system that isn't fit for them.
I hear a lot of terms that I find encouraging. As a school leader, as an educator, I hear you speaking in a way that suggests an asset-based approach. Mm-hmm. You ought to talk about centering the students. Henry, you had mentioned collaboration and shared leadership. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about how it is you shared in this process. Your co-authoring process and whether educators, writers should consider co-authoring. Because when I think about what you're saying and the fact that you published this book together, to me, there's a natural correlation in terms of, well, you're sharing leadership, you're centering people, you're also sharing this book. Sharing your thoughts, your insights, this approach together, leading together. And so what was that like? What was the process of co-authoring this book like for you?
So I'm happy to share. So actually, Henry and I met through Newton, and we were working together a lot, just in my role as the DI director. And he had told me he wanted to write a book, and was sharing with me some of his thought process in the early phases. And then after a few months, he asked me to join him on this. And at first, I was hesitant. I was like, "No, this is your book and your vision." But he did convince me to come on board. And I think what has been really, really important, and I think it shows up in the book, is that there are a lot of similarities to how we've experienced our educational path, our personal stories, but the roles in which we play, we were really able to complement each other because he's a building administrator. So he really can touch on the policies, the grading, the curriculum, the student experience. And from a administrator level for the district, and having the social work lens, I was really thinking about how do you shift a culture? How do you bring people in? How do you manage resistance? How do you empower folks to be a part of changing the system? So I think that there was such a nice complement of like strategy and empathy and just thinking about social emotional pieces. And I also think what has really shown up, and I'm losing my train of thought right now, but I just had another point that might come back to me about our partnership. But Henry, do you want to add?
Yeah, what I would say is that Kathy's been a great thought partner, and we share very similar stories. So both were Black students in mostly white schools, and with mostly white educators. We actually went to the same university, had very similar experiences there, and so. I think that we just matched really well, and there were a lot of things that I think now in hindsight we're like, oh my goodness, like it's just we're so glad that we had hit it off in that way. Writing a book is hard, so I think when I was able to kind of start outlining what this book was going to look like, it felt really impossible to do it as a working administrator. And, I just feel blessed that, that Cathy was the person that, that was there thinking it through with me. And it felt like a natural fit. And I 100% agree with her that it is a far better book because of that. We have a lot of activities that she has done in her work with educators. And, she's worked with coaches, she's worked with counseling departments, special ed departments. And so there's a lot of ways, how we think about school, a lot of different groups that sometimes feel left out when we just talk about instruction, right? And her experience as a DEI person, as a social worker, I think just provided huge assets and addressed a lot of blind spots that I wasn't aware of until we went through it. And I would say the process was, we divided it up. We selected different chapters to write, and, we actually went with the publisher that we went with, Dave Burgess Consulting, because, they really helped us to feel confident that they would be able to create a unified voice, which is what we were nervous about, because our writing styles were different. And our processes were different, but we edited each other's. So that was sort of the first step in terms of unifying that voice, is that we split up the chapters, and then, and I would say, oh, well, there's a story that I can add in here, or there's a story I can, that she could add into mine. And then we just kept flip-flopping in the editing process, which I think, ultimately created a unified voice for us.
Was it hard for you to bring her in? I ask because as a writer myself, even working through my editor's feedback makes me feel some type of way. I'm being honest.
Yeah.
I hear you.
And so I think it takes humility to bring somebody else into your writing. I hold my writing very dear to my heart. And so perhaps you're the same way, but I just wonder about that. Was it challenging for you? Did you feel like you had to humble yourself to bring her in? And for you too, Cathy, to lean into this and be like, all right, well, maybe I could just do my own thing instead of collaborating.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly interested in what Cathy's thought is here, but I thought it was really easy bringing her in. And part of it's that, as someone who communicates a lot, in my work, I have a lot of people editing it. I think going through the dissertation process as well, really beats up your any sort of overconfidence that you may have, that you don't need someone to rip it apart for you. So I did find the strength in it. I think that I think there were a couple moments that were challenging. One is that we're different writers, and you learn about each other's strengths. Really funny is that we had to cut 45,000 words out of the book.
Wow.
Right off the bat.
Yeah.
They were like, we're not going to,
that's tough.
We're not going to publish this. And we had to cut about over a third of the book. And I was telling some people in my staff this, and they go, "What? You're surprised by that?" They go, "You are verbose." I go, "What do you mean I'm verbose?" They go, "Have you ever read your newsletters?"
Oh man, that's
so
great.
So it was like, and Cathy is very direct to the point, and so it was. I think that was super helpful. And the other point was she said, "You need to trust me on the book cover," and that was probably our most tense moment was debating the book cover. And I think it's a beautiful book cover, so I give her 100% credit for that.
Wow. Thank you. I think one of the things, and I remember I was going to say that I think the piece of the book that really came together is we were always very clear on what we wanted it to be, and what we wanted the message to be, and what we wanted people to take from it. Where, it gets tricky is that our writing styles are different. Just like Henry's staff knows that he's verbose, I take pride in being considered a succinct writer. So there were times where I would write something and think it was so profound, and Henry'd be like, "You need to write more." And yeah, your ego gets and I haven't gone through the dissertation process. I'm like, "What are you talking about?" Right? Or he'd write something and I'm like, "Wait, it's a lot." So I think there was a lot. That was the negotiating. And I think overall through the editing process, we hit the right tempo and the right amount. But there were never issues about we shouldn't do that or we should do this. We agreed on the template and the purpose from the beginning to end. And it was interesting that the trickiest part was the cover. After we got through that whole editing process, we came closer as a process. And then we're the fun part, the cover is where it got heated up a little bit. But, I think we're just really, really proud and happy with all of the book. So
it must have been such a great learning experience for both of you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, you mentioned dividing up the chapters. Which chapter was the most challenging for you to write?
I thought the assessment was the most challenging.
Yeah. That's awesome.
And I think it's telling. I think it's telling that a lot of educators don't follow that step. But we used an Evolving for Learning model for the book, which was to do your own work through this and to do your own to lead through your culture is to follow a cycle of learn, reflect, act, and assess. We saw a couple of vulnerabilities where when people try to do anti-racist work is that they go right into action and they haven't done any research, they haven't learned anything, and their bias clouds the action. Mm-hmm. Or their community is not ready for it. There's a lot of reasons why that action fails. It actually could strengthen the systemic racism in the organization if you go straight to action. How many times do we see someone say, "Oh, I just read this book, I'm going to do this tomorrow," right? And not thinking through sort of what the impact is. And when we're dealing with our own bias, when we're dealing with hundreds of years of racism, you have to take a methodic approach. And then the last step after act is to assess it. Did this work, right? And this is where did our action lead to dismantling racism, to improving student lives, or did it do nothing, or did it, even worse, hurt students? And I think a lot of people, miss that. I thought it was really hard because, it's easy to make, the other steps really fun and engaging, and assessment is really hard work. It can be dry, but it's important. I think that's what we're really focused on. And secondly, is that it's vulnerable. is that our district has not solved racism, right? Like we still have a lot of work to do, and there's no school district that has solved racism. So the assessment is you have to be vulnerable. You have to be willing to say, we really messed up with this, right? We invested a lot of money and we messed up. Or we messed up with this hire. This is a human being. Like you have to be really vulnerable in that, in these moments. And so assessment was hard because it's challenging, it's vulnerable, and it's not the most exciting as the action that you're taking, right?
Right. Kathy, was that also the hardest for you?
Yeah, I was thinking about it, and it was definitely assessed because it also, like, how do you pack this into a chapter and help folks understand, like, really thoughtful ways to assess? So one of the things that I do in my role, and we get folks that say we want to do this, or we want to know what has the achievement gap changed, or has your discipline rates changed? And although these are very important measures and the things that we are actually trying to shift and dismantle, we're not always inviting those impacted to say, like, how did this land? Are you experiencing a difference? So there was also a push to bring in, again, those voices to say, what would make this a better experience? What would make learning more engaging? How safe do you feel in this community? And then go back to them and say, is there improvement? What are we missing? And making sure that they're involved in that entire process, whether it's teachers or students or families. So it was just how and shifting this mind of like these data measures that we become so accustomed to, that not being the end all be all, right? We actually want to see a culture shift, and you might not always capture that in measurable quantitative ways. So trying to put that in one chapter of the book and remind folks you have to go back to it. Because like Henry said, you get these big initiatives, or we did this and nothing changed, and helping people slow down through the process and really think about, how do I start to notice change in different ways?
Can I just add one other thing is that this is where I think you can also see white supremacy culture really playing out as well. Is that you've got to innovate in order to dismantle, to create student-centered and anti-racist practices and policies. And when you're asked by whatever outside group, what are the data points that are showing that this is working, right? And we want you to show it, 2 months after you've implemented it. And it's like, this is why our programs fail, is that it's either all or nothing. And we have to sort of understand is that it's student based, that there's a lot of components to why students are not succeeding in school, and our definition for success is so narrow in so many of our schools. So we have to unpack all of that, right? And that's the important piece of assessment, is that it can't just be a test, right? It's not standardized testing is not going to, tell you whether you are anti-racist or not. You've really got to unpack it, and that takes a lot of time. I think that's really where the work is really exciting. But at the same point is that too often we see, whether it's school boards, it's communities, it's state government, really looking at very easy ways to tell you whether you're succeeding or not, and it's just so much more complicated than that.
Yeah,
absolutely. So, what is one quote from the book that you think will resonate with readers the most?
So I want to, and I don't know if our quote is the same, but just when we started writing this book, it really was in the midst of kind of a movement for people to want to be involved and be engaged. It was very shortly after George Floyd and the other murders of Black folks. And by the time we were wrapping up the book, we already started to see this shift around kind of like this ban CRT movement.
Right.
And And we wanted to speak to that resistance and how do you keep staying committed through the resistance and how to actually expect the resistance. So a quote that really stands out to me, and we actually just shared it probably 2 weeks ago, but it says, we should expect resistance to manifest when we fight racism. Historically, it always has. So I think just historically, anytime you see advancement, anytime you see people engaged, that resistance shows up, and it shows up in legislation, it shows up in protests or communities, it shows up with money quieting folks. So I think that it's really important to recognize like this is a part of the work and dismantling what's been existent in our country for centuries, and that to stay committed and to keep pushing through and to not allow it to shut you down.
And that's a bar right there.
For me, it was, it's a story that we've gotten a lot of feedback from, which starts right in the beginning, is a story about one of our students, our former students, Lamari. And, in a nutshell, she was speaking to our current students about imposter syndrome, being a Black woman in a statistics class at a large majority white public university, and recognizing that she was ready and she was prepared, and she ended up found herself tutoring 2 white male students, and she was able to appreciate the moment, the power of that moment. And so in that we say that, who is anti-racist work for? And it's for students like her, but it's also it's for all students. So we say anti-racist cultures benefit all students because these cultures believe that all students thrive in learning environment that understands the inequities that exist due to racist structures and systems, commit to dismantling racism so that students know their school loves them, and 3, help students feel empowered to create change so that they will excel. And so that helps the white, affluent student with a lot of privilege, and it helps the student of color with, who feels like they don't have any privilege at all, or does not have any privilege at all, right? Is that if we can help them feel empowered to create change for all kids, we know we're doing the right thing. And then we're going to see these academic disparities be dismantled as well.
I love both quotes because one tackles the reality of the resistance that we often face in this work that we engage in, and the other affirms the reality that this anti-bias, anti-racist work is for all, that it's beneficial to everybody. And I would love to see more folks come around to that understanding. I'm hopeful your text will help push that forward.
I hope so too.
To those that are listening, what is a message of encouragement you want to offer them?
Wow. I think, I've been in this role for 2 years, and I do see the impact. I do see the shift. And I think one of the things that really stands out to me, and you go into this role and you're prepared for resistance, or no one wants to talk about racism all day. And what I've been really surprised about are how many people in the community want to do this work and don't necessarily know how to do it, or don't feel safe to do it, or don't feel supported by their supervisors or administrators. But once you create that space, and once you kind of create that consistency and that commitment, people are coming from all angles, students and parents and educators and principals and just community members saying, we want to be a part of this. We want this for our children. And we also work in a predominantly white school community. And we have these white parents saying, we want our children to understand this and be able to be inclusive and bring in all cultures. So I think if you create the space, I think you'll be really surprised by that majority of people want to invest in this. And I don't think I understood that when I took on this role. I think I went ready with armor to barrel through. And what I've learned is once I've created a space and a standard that that everyone is, well, the majority of folks are saying, yes, I want this for me, for my child, for my students, and in my profession too. I want to be better at this.
Agree. We know that 80% of educators report that they want to do this work. They want to do anti-racist work, and they want more professional development. So, we need to take the mindset that educators are in this work for the right reasons, but we've got to help them. We've got to support them. But it takes staying in the work, and I think that the story, one of the messages from the book, we talked about this. We talked about this recently, is that yoga influenced this book tremendously. And the idea that both of us have a strong yoga practice, and we talked to some people in the yoga community about how the history and the practice of yoga can teach us about this kind of work. And what we learned is just the idea of staying present and staying in it when it is hard, right? That's when you need it the most. Staying in this pose when it's the hardest is the same as, when you feel this resistance, you need to stay in that work, and don't back out. And I remember when I was in college, I saw Stokely Carmichael came to UMass, the legendary civil rights leader, was Kwame Ture at that time, right before he died, and someone was asking him about some incidents that we were dealing with in our school, and this guy was dealing with some hate incidents that were directed towards him, and he said, Stokely Carmichael said, "Stay in the work, just stay in the work," right? And I just think that is the message for social justice work: is that when we back out, we send a message. When we stay in it, we also send a message, even when that work fails, right? Even when we know it's going to be hard or it takes time. There are a lot of things we've done that our community or our staff have not accepted or agreed to, but there's a lot that they have, and we learn from both stories. So you just got to stay in it and not see this as an initiative. And I think that's where we're worried about where a lot of schools are going, is that they're putting equity as their, on their school improvement plan as a 1-year initiative, right? And check the box, right? And when I've talked to them, I've asked them how did it go? And they go, we're exhausted. And it's like, yes, you're exhausted, right? This work is lifelong. And you've got to take care of yourself, and you've got to play the long game. You can't see this as a quick fix.
Right.
For those that want to support your work by getting a copy of the text and also following your individual platforms, where can they do that?
So the book, we have a couple of things, a couple additional resources as well. So please buy the book. Give us a review. Help us to help other educators to see it. We are, if you go to henryjturner.com, there's a link for a course that you can take that goes along with the book. And there's also additional resources. We've got a whole website with study questions, reflection questions. So we would encourage people to go there. And we're all over social media. So you can find me at Turner HJ on Twitter, Instagram at Turner_HJ.
And just so I'm clear, the book can be bought at henryjturner.com.
So go to Amazon. I'd say go to Amazon. But if you go to, we have a link to purchase the book. If you go to henryjturner.com, we have links to get you to purchase the book there as well. But you can go straight to Amazon and search or your other stores. What are you in Google and search, change the narrative, and you should be able to purchase it.
Yes, it's on Kindle and paperback on Amazon, and also Barnes and Noble. You can find the book too. But again, like Henry said, it's all over our social media platforms and that particular website, which we're intentional about creating a page to support the material in the book on henryjturner.com.
And Cathy, what is your individual platform?
So I'm all over the place. So I do have a Twitter account, Kathy Lopes 21. My IG is Kathy Lopes 21, and I also have my own consulting business, and that website is inclusionconsulting.com, but it's with a K for KL. So inclusionconsulting.com, and I have some resources and some information there about how to find me, how to reach me if you need me. So.
And stay tuned. We're going to be doing some work together over the summer, and we'll be doing some stuff tied to the book and some book studies and whatnot as well.
Yep.
Hey, folks, once again, the book is Change the Narrative. Henry Turner, Kathy Lopes, inspiring y'all to do things the right way, to do things in an impactful way, to share the leadership, share the responsibility, and stay present in this work. Thank you both for being here. Thank you for all the insight. Wishing you much success with your book, Change the Narrative, and supporting all the work that you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, man. We appreciate you and appreciate the support that you've given us. So thank you so much.
Yes, and I don't think we shared that our foreword is written by you and your wife, Lorena.
Hey,
Multicultural Classroom, and that was a very, very exciting point for us when you both agreed to write our foreword, and it's beautifully written. So we have to give you and your wife a shout out for that as well.
No doubt.
Honored to make a small contribution to something that's going to be extremely impactful. As always, your engagement in our classroom is greatly appreciated. Be sure to subscribe, rate the show, and write a review. Finally, for resources to help you understand the intersection of race, bias, education, and society, go to multiculturalclassroom.com. Peace and love from your host, Roberto Germán.